a dying king lies in agony, his body ravaged by disease. In the dim halls of his palace, he clings to a crucifix as whispers of rebellion and defeat echo through his crumbling empire. This is the final chapter of King Philip II of Spain, a monarch who once ruled an empire on which the sun never set, now facing the sunset of his own life. How did it come to this? Stay with us as we unravel the dramatic end of Philip II's reign, a tale of ambition, faith, downfall, and legacy. Philip II did not seize power. It was thrust upon him. Born in 1527, the only legitimate son of the mighty Emperor Charles V, Philip inherited a domain so vast it spanned continents. At the height of his ascension in 1556, he became King of Spain, Lord of the wealthy Americas, Master of Italy and the Low Countries, and later claimed the throne of Portugal in 1580. For a time, he even held the title King of England through marriage to Queen Mary I. Imagine at barely 30 years old, you are now the sovereign of an empire so huge that the sun literally never sets on your lands. Philip was determined to be a worthy heir to this immense inheritance. From his father Charles, he learned the burden of defending Catholic Europe against all threats, Protestant rebels, Ottoman fleets, or any prince who dared challenge Habsburg supremacy. With solemn piety and steely resolve, the young king envisioned himself as God's champion on earth. In these early years, triumph came readily. He presided over Spain's golden age of influence and culture. Vast shipments of silver and gold poured in from the New World, filling his treasury and fueling grand projects like the monastic palace of El Escorial, a stone monument to his faith and power completed in 1584. Courtiers whispered that Philip's empire was limitless, stretching from Europe to the Philippines, an Asian archipelago named after Philip himself. But even as he reveled in these heights, Philip's character was reserved and methodical. He was dubbed Philip the Prudent, known for poring over state papers long into the night by candlelight. Each decision was weighed carefully, sometimes too carefully. This diligence earned him a reputation as a meticulous ruler, yet it also meant critical decisions were often delayed until it was too late. Still, in the early decades of his rule, every delay or misstep was masked by the sheer wealth and momentum of an ascendant empire. Spain's power seemed unshakable, and Philip appeared every inch the master of the world. But every rise sets the stage for a fall, and storm clouds were already gathering at the edges of Philip's empire. Philip II's ambitions knew no bounds. As a devout Catholic monarch, he hungered to expand his dominion and defend the faith. In 1571, he celebrated one of the greatest naval victories of the age, the Battle of Lepanto. His half-brother Don John of Austria, leading a Holy League fleet funded by Philip, shattered the Ottoman navy and saved the Mediterranean from Turkish expansion. Church bells rang out across Europe at this triumph, a resounding affirmation of Philip's self-appointed mission as the shield of Christendom. The victory at Lepanto was hailed as the greatest naval victory since Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea, and it cemented Philip's image as the Catholic champion triumphant over the infidel threat. Emboldened by such glory, Philip pushed his empire to new extents. When the King of Portugal died without an heir, Philip seized the opportunity. In 1580, he marched troops into Lisbon and successfully claimed the Portuguese crown. In one stroke, Spain and Portugal united under Philip, bringing Brazil, Africa, and Asia's spice trade into his grasp. It was an astonishing accumulation of power. No European king had commanded such worldly riches since perhaps Charlemagne or Caesar. If you were a contemporary observer, you might have believed Philip II was invincible. By the 1580s, he was at the apex, monarch of a Spanish golden age, patron of the arts and architecture, and leader of a mighty Catholic empire. Yet, beneath the golden facade, cracks had begun to form. Every triumph carried the seeds of future troubles. The wealth from the Americas led to soaring inflation at home and mounting debts. Philip declared state bankruptcy multiple times. His empire's vastness made it unwieldy. Urgent decisions took weeks or months via correspondence, and local governors often acted beyond his control. And while Philip saw himself as ordained to rule, others whispered that God's favor could be fickle. As he basked in glory, far to the north, a defiant spirit was rising that no cannon or treasure could easily crush. Philip's greatest challenges would not come from legendary sea battles or golden treasures, but from his unyielding faith and those who refused to bow to it. To understand Philip II's decline, you must understand his faith. He was, above all, a fierce Catholic zealot. Philip believed utterly that unity under the Catholic Church was the only path for his people's salvation, and he was willing to wage war on his own subjects' souls to ensure it. Before suffering the slightest damage to religion in the service of God, he famously declared, "I would lose all of my estates and 100 lives if I had them, because I do not intend, nor do I desire, to be the ruler of heretics." This was no empty rhetoric. Under Philip, the Spanish Inquisition reached new heights of intensity. Imagine living in a Spain where the Inquisition's shadow loomed everywhere. In Philip's Spain, Protestant teachings and even scientific books were banned. Students were barred from studying in foreign, potentially heretical universities. Inquisitors scoured the land for any whiff of unorthodoxy. By Philip's orders, at least 70,000 forbidden books were burned in pyres of faith, so many that the night sky of Iberia often glowed with the embers of knowledge turned to ash. Even the highest in the land were not safe. The Archbishop of Toledo, Bartolomé Carranza, a revered theologian, was jailed for 17 years, merely on suspicion that some of his writings were tinged with Protestant ideas. Families trembled as neighbors vanished into dungeons. Public auto da fe executions saw accused heretics burned alive in city plazas. Terrifying spectacles meant to purify Spain's soul through fear. Philip watched these flames approvingly, convinced he was doing God's work. He personally scrutinized lists of banned books while ironically building a vast library at El Escorial that secretly kept some of those very volumes locked away for his own study. In his mind, there was no contradiction, only his duty as a Catholic king. But this relentless persecution had an unintended effect. It stifled Spain internally. Scholars fled, ideas stagnated, and stoked fury abroad. To Protestants across Europe, Philip became the embodiment of tyranny. A fanatical and despotic monster, his enemies called him, blaming him for cruelty and bloodshed. And nowhere did his uncompromising zeal backfire more dramatically than in the Netherlands, where a rebellion was brewing that would shake the foundations of his empire. By trying to save everyone's souls, Philip was about to lose an entire nation. The stage was set for revolt. The Netherlands was one of Philip's richest domains, a buzzing hub of trade and culture. But to Philip, the most important thing about the Low Countries was that Protestant heresy had taken root there. He was determined to stamp it out, no matter the cost. The Dutch, however, had long enjoyed certain freedoms and resented distant rulers meddling in their affairs. Philip's actions soon lit the fuse of rebellion. In the 1560s, he aggressively reorganized the Dutch church hierarchy, creating new bishoprics and empowering the Spanish Inquisition to hunt heretics in these provinces. To the Dutch nobility, this felt like an attack on their traditional rights and influence. To Dutch Protestants, especially Calvinists in the north, it was nothing short of a declaration of war on their faith. Picture this: Antwerp, 1566. Outraged by the Inquisition's brutality, crowds of Dutch Calvinists rampaged through churches, smashing statues of saints, an eruption of fury known as the iconoclastic fury. Philip's response was merciless. He dispatched Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, with an army to crush the dissent. Alba established a regime of terror, executing thousands, including prominent nobles, in what came to be called the Council of Blood. The crackdown only poured fuel on the fire. Soon the provinces were in full-scale revolt under the leadership of William of Orange. Philip, ever stubborn, poured enormous resources into the conflict, determined to reclaim his wayward subjects at sword point. For decades, bloody battles and sieges raged across the Low Countries. Cities like Haarlem and Leiden suffered horribly. The cost to Spain was staggering. Soldiers' salaries drained the treasury, and loans were taken at ruinous interest to fund the endless campaigns. Still, Philip refused any compromise on religious freedom. Rather than tolerate a single Protestant congregation, he would bankrupt his empire, and in a way he did. By the 1570s and 1580s, Spain's economy was bleeding, with one bankruptcy following another, much of it due to the quagmire in the Netherlands. Finally, by 1581, the 7 northern provinces declared their independence as the Dutch Republic, no longer recognizing Philip as their king. Philip had lost an entire nation. The southern Netherlands, today's Belgium, remained under Spanish control, but the dream of a completely Catholic Low Countries was gone forever. The Dutch revolt became one of Philip's greatest failures, a humiliation he would never fully concede. As news of each Dutch victory reached him, Philip grew more isolated and suspicious. He retreated further into the sanctum of El Escorial, brooding over dispatches and praying for a miracle to turn the tide. Across the sea, another formidable foe watched Philip's struggles with interest, and soon their rivalry would explode in one of history's most infamous naval showdowns. While rebellion flared in the Netherlands, Philip II's relations with England went from alliance to animosity. In the 1550s, he had been the king consort of England alongside his Catholic wife, Mary I. But Mary's death in 1558 ended that union, and her successor was her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth Thurs, a queen who would become Philip's greatest Protestant rival. At first, Philip politely offered to marry Elizabeth, perhaps hoping to keep England in the Catholic fold, but nothing came of it. Over the years, distrust turned to open hostility. Elizabeth knew Philip was the world's most powerful Catholic monarch, and she positioned herself as the Protestant defender. She funded the Dutch rebels fighting Philip. She knighted pirates, privateers like Sir Francis Drake, who plundered Spanish treasure ships laden with New World silver. And in 1587, Elizabeth executed Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic claimant to England's throne, eliminating a potential pro-Spanish ally. For Philip, that was the final straw. By 1588, Philip II was ready to invade England itself to bring down Elizabeth. He built one of the largest armadas ever seen, 130 ships carrying about 30,000 men. The Spanish Armada, as it would be known, set sail under the banner of a holy crusade to depose the heretic queen and restore England to Catholicism. Imagine the awe and fear across Europe as this flotilla departed Spain, great war galleons bristling with cannons, sails emblazoned with the cross, crews singing Ave Maria as they headed into the English Channel. It must have seemed that no force on earth could stop Philip's armada, but the armada's fate would become the stuff of legend and an enduring symbol of hubris. As the proud Spanish fleet approached England, they were met not only by the fire and fury of the English Navy, but by the unpredictable power of nature. English ships, more maneuverable and led by intrepid commanders like Drake, harassed the Armada. Fire ships sent by the English scattered the Spanish formation in panic. Then came the infamous Protestant wind. A howling Atlantic storm engulfed the Armada as it tried to retreat. Giant galleons were blown off course and wrecked upon the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. When the battered remnants of Philip's great fleet limped back to Spain, half the ships were gone and thousands of men had drowned. The impossible had happened. The invincible Armada was decisively defeated. Philip met this disaster with stoic resolve. When word reached him of the Armada's destruction, he reportedly said, "I sent my fleet against men, not against the wind and the waves." In that single sentence, you can almost hear his resignation, a belief that he had done all he could, and the outcome was in God's hands. Outwardly, Philip maintained that the calamity was God's will. In private, it was a crushing blow. The defeat of 1588 shattered Spain's aura of naval invincibility. And yet, Philip's fight with Elizabeth was not over. Incredibly, he launched 2 more armadas in 1596 and 1597, refusing to accept failure. But both expeditions were scattered by storms as well, almost as if fate itself was determined to thwart Philip's plans. The Anglo-Spanish War dragged on, but neither side landed a decisive blow, and it would only grind to an end years after Philip's own death. By the 1590s, the toll of war and rebellion was undeniable. Spain was overstretched and exhausted. The nation had tasted glory, but now ordinary Spaniards felt hunger and despair. The government coffers were empty. Philip's regime had defaulted on its debts again in 1596. Prices for food skyrocketed. There were murmurs of unrest in Castile, in Aragon, in Portugal. The very foundations of Philip's empire were starting to crack under the weight of endless conflict, and Philip II himself was a shadow of the vigorous king he had once been. The mighty king, who once sent armadas across oceans, was now fighting a more personal battle against time, pain, and his own failing flesh. In his final decade, Philip II was a man in perpetual pain. Years of stress, rich diet, and perhaps genetic illness caught up with him. He suffered from severe gout, the so-called disease of kings, which inflamed his joints and left him increasingly immobile. Malaria from the swamps around Madrid gave him recurring fevers. By the mid-1590s, the once powerful monarch could barely walk. For the last 3 years of his life, Philip was literally strapped into a custom-made chair. This contraption held his swollen, painful body almost motionless, as any movement caused him agony. Imagine the irony. The ruler of a vast empire, bound to a chair like a helpless invalid, carried from room to room in his palace. His condition was more gruesome than most knew. The gout had produced open sores on his legs that refused to heal. They became infected to the point that Philip's flesh reportedly bred maggots, a detail almost too horrific to believe. Courtiers were said to gag from the stench in his chambers. Yet Philip endured it with grim piety. In these torturous final months, he clung ever tighter to his faith. He filled his rooms with holy relics of saints, hoping for a miracle, or at least spiritual comfort. Too weak to attend Mass in person, he had priests celebrate it in his bedroom. Surrounded by maps and dispatches, he still tried to govern, scrawling orders in shaky handwriting, refusing to let go of the reins of empire, even as his body betrayed him. Those who visited Philip in his last days found a man profoundly changed. Gone was the aloof, steely king. In his place was a suffering penitent, more monk than monarch. He confessed his sins frequently, engaged in constant prayer, and prepared for death with the same meticulous attention he once gave to ruling. Outside the thick walls of El Escorial, the world moved on. Armies fought in France and the Netherlands. Explorers claimed new lands in Philip's name. Ministers made decisions without him. Inside, Philip lived in near total seclusion, attended by doctors and monks. It was as if he had already entombed himself in the granite mausoleum he built. Still, he persevered day after day, hour after hour, in unrelenting pain. At last, the end came, quietly and almost humbly, for the man who had moved kings and popes like pieces on a chessboard. Shortly before dawn on September 13th, 1598, King Philip II of Spain breathed his last. It was 5 in the morning, and a pale light was creeping over the horizon. In the chapel of El Escorial, seminarians chanted the morning mass, their voices echoing through the hushed corridors of the monastery palace. In his bedchamber, surrounded by his surviving family and priests, Philip's tortured journey ended. The 71-year-old king, gaunt and ghostly, finally succumbed. likely to a debilitating cancer compounded by decades of illness. At that moment, the pages of history turned. A reign of 42 years had come to a close, ending the era of one of Europe's most powerful and polarizing monarchs. For a man who had lived so grandly, Philip's death was strikingly simple. There were prayers, tears, and the last rites. The king's final wish was to have a crucifix and a relic of the true cross in his hands. He died literally clutching the symbols of the faith that had guided and consumed his life. One chronicler wrote that Philip died as a monk in the building he built as a king, reflecting on the solitude and piety of his final moments. When his passing was announced, church bells tolled across Spain. Some subjects wept, fearing the loss of the great protector of Catholicism. Others quietly sighed in relief, hoping the wars and burnings might now end. Philip's body was placed in a plain coffin and taken to lie in state. Looking at the frail corpse, courtiers could hardly reconcile it with the figure who had once commanded armies and kingdoms. His remains were interred in a crypt beneath the altar of El Escorial in the Pantheon of Kings as he had planned. In that cold marble chamber, the man who had styled himself the most Catholic king joined his ancestors in eternal rest. Yet even in death, Philip II's presence loomed large. He left behind an empire at its zenith in size, but fragile in foundation. The burdens of near-constant war and religious persecution had strained Spain to its breaking point. As his funeral rites concluded, many must have wondered what the future held. Would Philip's policies and conquests endure? Or would the edifice of Spanish power begin to crumble without the iron will of its architect? The legacy of Philip II would be debated for centuries to come. Was he a righteous guardian of Christendom, or a tyrant who sowed the seeds of Spain's decline? In truth, he was both. Philip II's life and reign remain a study in contrasts. On one hand, he had overseen the apogee of Spanish power, a global empire unmatched in scope, the flourishing of arts and literature, and the defense of Catholic Europe against formidable foes. Under his rule, Spain experienced moments of glory and cultural brilliance: the works of El Greco, the prose of Cervantes, the wealth of the Americas. He was the monarch of the Spanish Golden Age, and when he died, Spain was still revered and feared across Europe. His supporters in his own time beatified his memory, praising him as an ideal Christian king who upheld virtue and tradition. On the other hand, Philip left his successors an empire burdened by debt and conflict. The cracks that had begun under him would widen in the 17th century. Spain would slowly lose its dominance. The treasury would remain perpetually bankrupt, and new powers like England and France would rise as Spain's star dimmed. Many of these troubles traced back to Philip's reign: his unbending policies that fueled the Dutch revolt, the staggering costs of his wars of religion, and an economy distorted by plundered silver. The Dutch Republic he failed to suppress would go on to become a thriving independent nation, a bitter loss for Spanish pride. England, which he failed to conquer, remained Protestant and would soon challenge Spanish sea power around the world. Even within Spain, the seeds of decline were sown. Agriculture and industry suffered, while fortunes were wasted on war. Philip's personal legacy is equally contentious. He was loved, and he was hated. To devout Catholics, he was Philip the Prudent, the noble guardian of the true faith who built monasteries and defended the church. To others, he was a black legend, the cruel tyrant behind the Inquisition's terror, the butcher of Flanders, the fanatic who tried to extinguish freedoms. Even before he died, writers were already splitting into two camps: those canonizing him as a model of piety, and those demonizing him as a scourge. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Philip II was a complex, driven, and flawed man. His reign changed the course of history in ways both inspirational and tragic. And so ends the tale of Philip II of Spain, a king who reached for the heavens even as the earth beneath him gave way. His end was not marked by a single dramatic fall. but by a slow, inexorable decline of his own making. It's a powerful reminder that even the mightiest of rulers are mortal, and that empires, like men, can wither from within. If you found this deep dive into history captivating, remember that even in our time, power and legacy remain fragile. What do you think is Philip II's ultimate legacy? Cautionary tale or admirable conviction? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey through the past, please hit that like button and subscribe for more cinematic histories. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the dramatic turns of history's greatest empires.